Thank you, and welcome everyone to the session. As stated, today we're going to be talking about the 3D printing efforts during the COVID crisis and how it helped overcome some of the supply chain shortages we have been witnessing, especially in the first half of last year. So, just a brief introduction about myself. I'm Kit Swabs. I'm handling the business development for factory solutions at Formlabs for Greater Europe. So first off, I want to start with a few words about Formlabs. For those who are unfamiliar with the company, and to basically give a better idea of what we do and what is our role within this industry. So the main idea behind Formlabs is to create reliable, accessible 3D printing systems for professionals. So really we're aiming to allow the access to digital fabrication and eventually help anyone make anything. So it's a very ambitious scope, but we actually do believe we can arrive at this point. And the company is actually fairly recent. We started off in 2012 when we revolutionized the world of stereolithography 3D printing with the release of the Form 1. Before the Form 1, actually, this technology was very expensive and really reserved to certain industrial applications. So the goal with the Form 1 was to reduce the price of SLA stereolithography by around a factor of 100. So instead of a machine that was worth several hundred thousands of dollars, have a printer that was accessible for a few $1,000s instead. So after the Form 1, we have had several iterations until the current ones that you see over here, the Form 3 and Form 3B, as well as the Form 3L and 3BL. So in a relatively short number of years, we've really made the technology evolved from what was the beginnings with the Form 1 to a higher performance, higher volume SLA printing technology. And for those who follow our news, we actually have recently released the Fuse 1, which is our introduction of Formlabs technology in the SLS 3D printing world. So to give a bit of context, our company has around 600 people. We're spread out through 7 offices on 3 continents, so Boston, Berlin, and Singapore. We have 3 factories in the US, in China, and Hungary. We have about 150 research engineers and scientists. So R&D, whether it is for hardware or for materials, is very important for us, and we all do all of that in-house. Finally, since the inception of the company, we have sold over 60,000 printers worldwide in over 40 countries, and we have allowed a production of over 40 million parts worldwide. So this is a brief introduction to Formlabs. You can find actually a lot of news online about us, so I'll keep it relatively short. Now, moving on to the main subject, I'd like to come back a bit to last year and basically remind a bit what happened during the first half of last year when it came to the COVID crisis and the subsequent shortages in medical supplies. So it was all over the news. We had basically shortages in various items necessary for testing, but also for healthcare professionals. So we're talking about testing swabs, we're talking about personal protection equipment, amongst many other things. So this was a real problem back then because things such as even masks, self-protection masks, were relatively difficult to find. And therefore, a lot of companies try to find a way to alleviate these shortages issues and resolve this problem. So why 3D printing then? There are actually a lot of methods to produce medical devices, personal protection equipment, and 3D printing may not appear for some as the most obvious way to do it. And so in this part, I will try to explain a bit what pushed different companies to adopt this technology in order to produce and compensate for these shortages. So additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, has a few distinct advantages over other manufacturing processes. So these are general advantages that I'm stating over here, not necessarily linked specifically to the manufacturing of medical devices. First off, we're talking about mass customization, because basically you can introduce any design into a 3D printer and print it without any additional tooling. So you can vary the design of the part you're producing at every single job. It also allows for complex shapes. Due to the inherent nature of the additive manufacturing process, we are able to produce shapes that are not necessarily possible with subtractive or molding processes. It offers flexibility in manufacturing, and I'll come back to this a bit later on. The speed to market, which is very important, because without the need to manufacture additional tooling to produce your parts, you're very quickly able to release your production to the market. And finally, there's the digital inventory, which means that you don't need to have minimum quantities to start producing with 3D printing, and you can have a very streamlined production process. But coming back on point number 3, and this I think was the key aspect that led to the adoption of 3D printing during that period, the flexibility. Due to its, for example, if we took let's take a look at a machine like Forms 3D, due to its size and flexibility of placement, 3D printing can be very easily scalable, and more importantly, in the context of last year's shortages, it can allow for localized production. You're no longer relying on overseas suppliers to bring in your goods. And so I think this was the key distinguishing factor that led to the adoption of the technology for manufacturing. So because 3D printing allows for any shape and size depending on the machine, it's actually very easy to produce different types of medical devices, personal protection equipment, and it's very easy to set up this production infrastructure with this technology. On the screen, you can see just a variety of medical devices that have been produced in different materials, most of them biocompatible. So now we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive in the actual applications that 3D printing covered during the crisis to alleviate the supply chain shortages. Now, the most mediatized one, and arguably one of the most impactful ones, was the creation of nasopharyngeal swabs, or PCR tests. And actually, I have a batch printed over here. Now, nasal swabs were in very short supply, and therefore were impeding the ability of testing in various countries. And to address this issue, it actually started off in the US, where medical institutions like USF Health and Northwell Health designed a swab that was compatible and that could be produced through SLA 3D printing. These swabs were validated eventually and then mass produced in various locations, not just in the US, but also in Europe, and before distribution throughout the world. So this is really the most, how can I say, it's really the most visible example of what has been done with 3D printing during the COVID crisis. And I'll come back a bit more to the swabs later on, because it's a really interesting application. So as you can see over here, it was just not in the US, but here we have another example, and this was the Hospital Virtual Valdecilla that designed also their own swab in Spain. Another application of 3D printing was the creation of BiPAP and CPAP adapters. The swabs were in shortage, PPE was in shortage, but also ventilators for COVID patients were in shortage. And one of the methods to alleviate this shortage was to convert BiPAP and CPAP machines into ventilators. And for that, you needed to have special adapters. And you see the ones over there are actually printed on Formlabs printers with a material that has since been validated for use in airway passages. Along the same spirit and logic, another methodology to alleviate for the shortages of ventilators was ventilator splitters, basically to split the use of a ventilator between several patients. Now, this is more of a controversial application because splitting the ventilator between different patients may affect the efficiency of the ventilator, but some hospitals have resorted to this in emergency situations. When it comes to personal protection equipment, some very ingenious companies and medical institutions throughout the world, so in Europe and here again in Spain, have actually employed 3D printing to adapt commercially available scuba diving masks to respirators. Now, basically, you just 3D print the adapter and basically fit it on the top of the scuba mask. So that was a very ingenious application that allowed healthcare professionals throughout the world to basically practice safely, and this despite the short supply of respirators. Finally, a lot of initiatives were created throughout the world for printing, especially PPE, not necessarily in the field of a medical institution, but for public usage worldwide. So an example over here was this bracket to support a face shield. So it is printed, this one is printed in a biocompatible material. It's relatively flexible and can basically accommodate the placement of a face shield. So this is one of the many applications that people have thought, and people have been overall very ingenious in exploiting and leveraging the flexibility of 3D printers in order to produce various supplies and protection equipment. Now, one of the common perceptions of 3D printing is that, well, it's a great piece of equipment that allows for a lot of flexibility in the design of the parts, and it's very easy to set up. But one of the perceived caveats of 3D printing is the speed of production. And to a certain extent, that is true. Let's say, for example, you're printing just a few pieces on a printer, be it a smaller one like the Form 3B or a larger one like the Form 3L. It may take a few hours to produce that part. And a lot of people may be thinking, so how do you produce enough swabs, for example, to cover a significant part of the population? Is it actually practical to use 3D printing in that context? Well, actually, 3D printing is, and this is coming back to the scalable aspect of the technology, can be surprisingly productive when it comes to the manufacturing of end-use parts. So if you're producing, let's say, just, again, thinking about the example of one swab on a 3D printer, well, that may take, let's say, I don't know, 30 minutes or maybe an hour for the production of one swab. But if you optimize your print job and fit in as many swabs as possible on a platform, and you multiply the number of 3D printers to a large print farm like the one you're seeing on the screen right now, we're actually able to produce significant quantities and much higher quantities that people would initially think. It's basically by optimizing print jobs and increasing the number of printing devices, we're able to have almost exponential growth in productivity. And this is basically the spirit that motivates our factory solutions, for example. It's basically leveraging our 3D printing technology, but at an industrial scale. And this basically consists of, on one hand, a print farm with several printing machines printing simultaneously, but also the whole ecosystem that includes post-processing, that includes the resin supply, and adjacent services to basically consult with customers and help them better optimize the printing jobs. And this is a methodology that has been used in the past with different applications. So here you see just a few examples of customers that have been leveraging the factory solutions in order to produce in large volumes. New Balance has been producing running shoe midsoles with Formlabs technology and custom material. Gillette has been producing custom razor handles, again, through our technology. And you have other examples like dental aligners, which actually print enormous volumes throughout the world, and manufacturing as well for tooling in this example. So if you look at the swab example again, the same principle can be applied. This is one of our customers in Canada, Precision ADM. They actually have a significant number of Form 3Bs and are able to produce in the hundreds of thousands of swabs at a time. And we estimate that Formlabs customers have been producing during this period over 4 million swabs. So we're talking about a period of a few months for COVID-19 testing. So again, it's 3D printing may, for some, have the perception of being a relatively slow process, but when used properly and scaled up properly, we can actually achieve very interesting productivity. So now the supply shortages have been, in most part, resolved, and basically we may not need to produce as many swabs or as many personal protective equipment or a respirator and ventilator adapters as we needed to in the first half of last year. But 3D printing is actually still very important in the medical and healthcare space these days. And the use of 3D printers is not limited to the creation of COVID supplies. First example, and some for which I have a lot of samples around me at the moment, is the creation of anatomical models. So with a variety of materials available, be it rigid material or more flexible materials, like the one you see over here, and different levels of finishes with transparency and also biocompatibility. 3D printing, especially through SLA technology, allows for the very detailed and high fidelity reproduction of anatomical models. The process in principle is relatively straightforward. It's basically we're using the data that has been acquired either through an MRI or a CT scan. This data is then translated into a dedicated software like the ones provided by GE Healthcare into a printable 3D model that is then sent to a printer like the Form 3B or the Form 3L to reproduce basically the said model. And once this is done, the model can be used for various applications. Of course, there are applications around training and education, but a lot of the times, these models are actually used for surgical planning. And so basically are key to basically ensuring the success of a complex procedure. And the fact that some of our materials are biocompatible means that they can also be brought into the operating theatre for examination during the operation itself. So here you can see an example of an anatomical model that has been printed with a clear material and another that has been inserted in the colored material. Let me go back. So this is useful for a variety of surgical procedures, be it cardiac, neurosurgery, orthopedic, maxillofacial, surgical oncology, or pediatric surgery. Finally, like we've seen with the COVID examples, 3D printing is also incredibly useful for medical institutions for on-site printing of medical devices if needed. So again, the use of biocompatible materials makes this possible. And should there be any on-site shortages, or should the institutions or companies require more flexibility in the production of these, 3D printing is also a valuable tool. So at Formlabs, we have understood this, and we provide a complete ecosystem ranging from, of course, biocompatible 3D printers, or 3D printers able to use biocompatible materials, to post-processing systems and a range of resins, such as Biomed Amber and Biomed Clear, that have been formulated specifically for this type of application. So we've actually trusted partners of quite a lot of medical device firms. And yeah, summarize, we have a technology that is able to scale with ease from low volume on-site production to actually full-scale end-use parts manufacturing. And then we have materials that are sterilizable and biocompatible. And all our resins are actually produced in the ISO 13485 facility. So if you'd like to know more, do feel free to book a conversation with us. We'll be glad to let you know more about how we've been working with these applications and see if we can help you with yours. And then you can always ask directly for me. Just realized I didn't put in my email address, but you can ask, basically you can reach out to the Factory Solutions page and it'll get to me eventually. So if anyone has any questions, I mean, right now is actually a good time as well. Feel free to shoot. Let me just check my chat screen.
Thank you, Mr. Sauer. Dear participants, if you have questions, you can now enter them in the question box so that the Mr. Sauer can answer them. Thank you.
Well, actually, if there's no question on the spot, that's fine. Some people are a bit shy sometimes. But yeah, do feel free to reach out to us from our webpage. Yeah, we'll be happy to answer any inquiries then.
Mr. Sauer, one question has been received. Which printers are mostly relied upon for supplying swabs and medical supplies for the COVID response?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Which printers have been released for the...
Which printers are mostly released for sampling, swabs, and medical supplies for the COVID response?
Oh, okay. Well, in our case, obviously the Forms 3B, which is our printer made for medical and dental applications, has been the most used for its ability to use biocompatible materials, which are essential in a lot of the medical supplies used during the COVID crisis. Again, swabs is an example where the material has to conform with certain standards to be used when, well, basically inserted into your nasal cavity. So mostly the Forms 3B. And since the Forms 3L was released a bit later and available a bit later throughout the year, a bit less. But yeah, Forms 3B has been used very frequently in that scope. I hope that answers the question.
Another question has been received, Mr. Sauer. Which resin is used for nasal swabs?
For nasal swabs, we have a resin which is called Biomed Amber, which is suitable for the production of, most of the time it would be class 1 devices. Now the resin itself is not a class 1 medical device, but it has been used for the production of such devices. So it's, again, it's a biocompatible resin. It's sterilizable through autoclave, amongst other processes. And yeah, it's a resin that is used on the Forms 3B. I hope that answers the question. We have basically technical data sheets and safety data sheets available online for people that are interested in these types of resins. And there's more information on the conformity of those resins. Most of our biocompatible resins have been tested in accordance to ISO 10993 for sensitivization, irritability, and cytotoxicity.
Dear participants, if you have questions, you can now enter them in the question box so that Mr. Sauer can answer them. We have 15 minutes now. Mr. Sauer, I don't think there are any more questions. Do you have final words for our participants?
Yes, I would eventually. I mean, for me, despite all the problems occurred during the COVID-19 crisis, one of the small benefits, at least when it comes to 3D printing, is that it was a really good demonstration of the capabilities of the technology when it comes to manufacturing at scale. And I think people should not be dismissive of 3D printing technologies, whether it's stereolithography, selective laser sintering, or even FDM. When looking at manufacturing projects, especially if they're looking to produce in a localized fashion and want to have a flexible infrastructure, 3D printing often makes a lot of sense. So yeah, this would be my final words or recommendations, is do look into 3D printing if you have a manufacturing project. You'd be surprised by the capabilities of the technology and the productivity levels achieved. And thank you for attending.